My name is Matt Babcock. I'm a researcher with Kathleen Carley's CASOS group at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm going to present our group's take on the challenge question related to disinformation for BRiMS conference this year. And to start off, I want to take a look at the bigger picture and talk about how both academia and policymakers have been discussing recently how to create and implement different types of interventions in order to stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation online. And one of the tangles in that is that there are many different types of misinformation, many different types of false stories that can flow through social media. And that there are many different communities that can receive or reject that information. And so this mix of both different types of false information and different types of communities makes for a difficulty in one-size-fits-all type of interventions, or some interventions might work in some groups and not in others. So our basic question that we tried to get a little bit further along with in this project was to look at those differences, look at how different types of false information travel through and are responded to by different types of communities. To do that, we had a data set based on the Black Panther movie release. So Black Panther was a big, very large movie in February. It's a Marvel superhero movie. It was the most tweeted about movie ever. It was in part acknowledged for its inclusion and its representation of African American and African creators and actors. And so we had collected a large amount of Twitter data during this event, prior to and during this event, due in part because there was some speculation, some discussion on online forums about alt-right type groups talking about misinformation about the movie and other types of possible misinformation happening during that movie. So we collected around 5 million tweets, 150,000 of which we determined were related to a set of different types of false stories and false narratives that flowed through Twitter. We identified 4 different types. There are so the 4 different types that we identified were a group of tweets claiming that people were attacked going to the movie theater. Typically, these tweets had a racial element to them, either white people being attacked by black people or black people being attacked by white people. None of these stories were true. All the images that were used were taken from other media, from news stories 10 years ago, from different types of events. And Twitter, so these started being posted the night before the movie was released. At the same evening, Twitter community members responded to them, calling them out as fake, as false information. Additionally, other Twitter users started creating satire versions of these fake beating posts or fake attack posts. So there's another story. So satire, again, is a false type of information, even though it's meant to be used as a tool for pointing out something or bringing something to somebody's attention. And so a bunch of these satire posts were posted making fun of or trying to shame the original posters of fake information. There was also a group of posts that posted fake scenes, claiming certain types of scenes, again, typically related to either racial issues or sexual issues, that were aimed at claiming that the movie represented those things when it did not. And finally, again, there was a very pro-alt-right, a group of pro-alt-right posts that were claiming that the movie was claiming the movie pushed for a pro-right or alt-right, nationalistic, ethnocentric view of the world. And so these false stories exist in the same conversation. They exist in the same Twitter conversation about the movie and interacted with each other. And so, again, we're interested in seeing how there's a difference between the flow of different types of stories within different communities. As a first pass, our group decided to set the communities. Instead of organically finding the communities, we decided to say, look, if you have a community that has retweeted a certain type of false story, we're going to consider that entire community. So for instance, those that retweeted any of the posts that were related to fake attacks were considered one community. As retweets are commonly considered as support, as adding an agreement to whatever that post was, because you cannot add additional information for a retweet. And so there's 4 basic communities we kind of designed, we determined from the top down. We also added a 5th that was comprised of all users that talked about these fake stories but were not retweeting them. And so again, there's different types of responses that people can perform on Twitter. There are retweets of the original false tweet, which I, again, mentioned that can be assumed to be supportive. There are replies. People can reply to the false tweet, and the reply can either be supportive or not supportive. In our case, the vast majority of the replies were not supportive. They were calling out different types of false information. You can quote the original tweet, which is a retweet plus an additional bit of text. Again, those were typically used to call out the misinformation as opposing to promote it. And you can actually retweet the replies in quotes. So there's multiple levels at which the different parts of this conversation take place. For our analysis, we decided to only use those stories that had more than 100 responses. There were very many stories that had only a few responses, like 1, 2, or 0 responses. We had in total a collection of 300 posts that were fake of the 4 categories, but only about 10 of those had any real play in the conversation, in the larger conversation. So we took those 100 stories. None of the alt-right type stories had a large audience. None of them had over 100 replies or retweets. And in general, the alt-right conversation and sharing of information about Black Panther was within its own kind of subset community. So what we're going to be looking at is we want to know both how a story flows through a community, and in this case, we're going to look at the half-life, so how long it took for that story to reach half the amount of the total amount of responses within that community in hours. And we're also going to look at the total number to get a sense of how much a certain community responded to different types of stories. And we're not going. So again, we're going to kind of ignore the alt-right story because it was a much smaller kind of condensed story. And so here are some of the calculated half-lives in hours. On the left-hand side, you will see replies and quotes combined. And on the right-hand side, you'll see retweets. Each stacked vertically are the different communities. So again, we determined that the community was a community that spread fake scenes, that retweeted fake scenes is the top 2 plots, and then along the x-axis, you have the different types of stories. So for instance, the fake scene community did talk about the non-satire or the fake attack posts, and in this case, they have a kind of a larger spread in terms of the half-life of those stories. Whereas if their own stories in the fake scene community that shared fake scene posts, that half-life is lower. In general, replies and quotes have a longer half-lives, have a longer time in the conversation than, or appear longer from the origin of the tweet through time rather than retweets. Retweets happen a lot in a short amount of time. And also in general, the half-life of a story within its own community had a wider range and was typically longer. The only case where that was not true was the fake scene spreaders. That again, their response to the not satire group had more variance than within themselves. This is again the half-life, but in terms of the number of tweets. So this is how many tweets were half of the total tweets that either retweeted or responded otherwise to the different stories. The interesting part here is that you have some communities responding to other communities with a much larger amount than within their own community. So for instance, satire spreaders, those that spread satire information, satire posts, spread also spread not satire replies to and responses to non-satire posts. Again, most of the replies and quotes are things that attack those posts. So in this case, the satire community was much more attacking the non-satire posts than in the other cases in which most of the replies were within their own communities. As a quick example of this is an example of the top fake attack tweet, the top non-satire attack tweet. And this is not the half-life, but this is actually the tweets over time, both replies and retweets. Again, with the way we define the communities, only the non-satire spreaders have retweets of the non-satire story. And in this case, again, you can see that even though the non-satires did talk, they did mention and reply to their own story, the vast majority of the conversation and the replies to those posts were from outside, were from the satire spreaders or from those that didn't retweet any of the false information. You can also notice that there's a steep drop at the end of both the non-retweeters and the satire spreaders replies, and that is partially due to the account being suspended. So again, kind of a little bit of an example of perhaps the account was suspended because of the community response to this false information. And so again, when we did this, we discussed it as, we determined the communities as those that retweeted. A more organic way of doing that would be to find communities within the Twitter data based on a mix of the different networks in which they're involved. So for instance, there are reciprocal follower networks, there are hashtag sharing networks, and there are a number of different networks that we are going to look to in the future to kind of get a sense of the real communities that were in the conversation and those that pre-existed the actual false information. That way we can get a better sense of how this information flows through the different communities, and which will give a more accurate picture that might be more, we might be able to expand upon this with other data sets as well. Thank you.